Welcome everyone to tonight's program celebrating the life of singer and civil rights pioneer Joseph James, presented by Dana Whitson and Tami Bell of the Sausalito Historical Society. Tonight's presentation by Dana and Tami will be followed by a question and answer period where you received lots of good questions through the RSVP form. If those of you in the audience think of questions during the presentation or during the Q&A session, please use the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to send them in. I apologize in advance if we are unable to get to all of the questions. So we'll start off tonight's program with me introducing Dana. Dana Whitson worked for 35 years in local government. She retired after serving as Sausalito's first female city manager from 2000 to 2007. As an active volunteer with the Sausalito Historical Society, she endeavors to research and share the stories of people who have shaped our community with both adult audiences and as a history docent to third graders in the Sausalito Marin City schools. One of Dana's motivating factors in working on Joseph James's story was that her father was a Navy officer for 3 years on a ship built at the Marinship. Her dad would have loved hearing about Joseph James. Please welcome Dana Whitson.
Thank you, Abbott. I'm really pleased to be here tonight, and I think it's going to be more entertaining than what you would probably see on TV today, because this is a very uplifting story about a nation that was united and working together on a common goal, and a man who's just extraordinary. So with that, why don't we start the slideshow, and I'll be introducing Tami Bell, my co-presenter. Well, I'm having trouble seeing the slideshow, but I'm going to start. Oh, there it is. Good. Been having computer problems. So today you're going to discover the little known story about Joseph James. He's a Black man who, despite enormous odds, became a successful singer, union organizer, civil rights activist, among other things, and a welder. To understand him and really appreciate the enormity of his accomplishments, it's helpful to know more about his life story and the times in which he lived. During our research, we found a videotaped interview filmed during the latter part of his life, which allows you to see the real Joseph James, in a video format. So I think that's going to be something that really adds to our program today. Our co-presenter with me is Tami Bell, and Tami is someone that has a real connection to the Marinship because his parents moved as part of the Great Black Migration from the South to Marin County during World War II, and Tami spent his childhood living in Marin City. So he also is a docent or an ambassador with the Historical Society, and he's works in the program with the schools with me at playing Joseph James, and also played Joseph James in a presentation several years ago in Marin City. He's a teacher and administrator at a charter school in San Carlos. So please welcome Tami as he plays the role of Joseph James.
It's good to see all of you tonight. My name is Joseph Henry James. I was born in 1910 in Philadelphia to Joseph and Annie Melissa James. At the age of 3, my mother and I moved with my uncle Henry Hammond in Camden, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. My uncle Henry was like a father to me. He had 3 qualities I wanted to emulate more than anything else: his deep bass voice, his amazing capacity for beer, and his mustache. That mustache was magnificent. Well, I never made bass. I hit baritone and stayed there. My mustache isn't anything like Uncle Henry's, and neither is my capacity for beer. Uncle Henry supported us by shoveling coal 10 to 12 hours a day in Camden, New Jersey furnaces. Eventually, the whole left side of his face was permanently singed by the heat blasting out of the furnaces. I guess you could call our entire family musically gifted. Uncle Henry led a church choir for a while, and my mother had a lovely alto voice. I had a much older sister who sang with the great Marian Anderson in Philadelphia. Life isn't soft for a little Black kid with nothing but the streets to play in. My mother could see that from a little innocent window breaking, I'd soon be hitting the big time. So a year after she died, I was packed off to Prince Anne Academy, a Negro boarding school in Maryland. Pennies were kind of short then, but I was even sure I wanted to be a singer. I found myself as part of the school quartet to earn my tuition.
Music became Joseph James' ticket to a college education. He traveled throughout the US and abroad as part of a famed Black quartet that toured to raise funds for their school, singing Negro spirituals, which had come back into popularity in the 1920s, to live audiences and radio broadcasts. The odds were stacked against young Joe James ever succeeding as a singer. He had lost both of his parents, had no money, and while he was still a teenager, the country had plunged into the Great Depression. Throughout the US, incomes plummeted, but Black families were hit particularly hard, with half of all Black workers unable to find jobs. With some members of the Princess Anne Academy Quartet facing graduation in 1929, the group shopped around for another Black college willing to fund their education. They ended up at Claflin College in South Carolina. Traveling for the first time to the Deep South was a real eye-opener for young James.
I guess I should have expected it, but moving into the Jim Crow rail car when the train hit Norfolk was something of a shock. I got out of the grimy rattle trap during a stopover to get a bite to eat because they wouldn't serve us in the diner. I walked over to a restaurant. As I opened the door, the Negro janitor frantically waved me away. I didn't understand until he yelled for me to go around back. There was a little window in the back of the restaurant, something like the door of a doghouse, where they threw food at you. It's kind of took my appetite away, and that's kind of a trick for an 18-year-old still growing. Well, we sang for 2 years at Claflin, but we didn't see much of the place. They sent us all over the country singing to raise funds for college. Once in a while, we would get a few dollars for ourselves, and sometimes the college would throw a benefit so that we could buy some clothes. When we hit Boston on the tour, I began to realize there was more to this music game than I ever learned in South Carolina. So I stayed in Boston and sang on the radio. Later, I decided to find how music was put together and learned about the guys who did it.
Joseph James broadened his musical education and repertoire at Boston University College of Music, performing several baritone solos at student assemblies.
You know, the Great Depression brought home the reality that I had to either eat or play music. So we left school to seek employment as a singer. I joined an amateur production of Rolls Sweet Chariot as a solo baritone. That production progressed into a 7-day paid role on Broadway. So at the age of 23, I had launched my Broadway career. Just as I was wondering what to do next, Eva Jesse came along with an invitation to join her famous choir on a concert tour. That was a weird trip. Almost 20 of us jammed into two 7-passenger sedans covered with suitcases and trunks. We covered 6,000 of the most agonizing miles I'd ever traveled, breaking down all the way. We'd crawl out from under the car we were trying to patch together to go on stage and sing as if nothing had happened.
Returning to New York after that tour, James got another incredible break. He was cast by Eva Jesse in the Broadway premiere of George Gershwin's musical, Porgy and Bess. Porgy ran for over a year on Broadway. James parlayed that success by moving to Hollywood to join the Hall Johnson Choir in the chorus of the film, The Green Pastures. Joseph James had his first title role in Los Angeles with the Federal Theater Project Negro Unit, which is a branch of the WPA for unemployed actors, in the musical Run Little Children.
Run Little Children was a folk play about a righteous, holy, God-fearing people who were confronted with what they considered a heathen cult, who pitched a tent on a vacant lot near this little town. And a lot of good church-going people were attending ceremonies of a pagan cult. It caused a lot of conflict, and therein lies the drama. Hall Johnson composed the music for the cult to sound very mysterious and strange, but enticingly beautiful.
James later starred in the Federal Theater Project's production of Swing Mikado. Now, this was a Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, that was transformed with an all-Black cast and swing dancers, and it was presented in the 1939 Treasure Island Exposition in San Francisco.
The lyrics and the dialogue for Swing Mikado is a side-splittingly funny. My friend Jester Hairston played the role of Coco to my role of Pooh Bah, which meant that we had a lot of dialogue together. Jester is in a class by himself as a comedian. The way he could deliver a line was devastating. I would feed him a line, and of course, he would have to reply to it, and his reply would crack me up on stage. I had to fight just to keep from just rolling on the floor. That was about the most stimulating experience I've ever had in theater.
Congress abruptly canceled the Federal Theater Project in 1939, causing the Swing Mikado to be canceled, despite the fact that it was getting rave reviews. Joseph James continued working whenever he could. However, the bombing of Pearl Harbor put his career on hold. Here is the real Joseph James in an interview recorded in 1992.
Let's talk a little bit about the war coming and how you made the decision to go to work in the shipyard, which would lead you into a lot of interesting activities. You're an actor. Why does an actor become a welder?
Oh, well, it starts out with a tragicomic situation. By that I mean this. When I found out about the attack on Pearl Harbor, I was with the Hall Johnson Choir doing the music for a movie called Tales of Manhattan. And we were in the midst of singing a tune. Good news, good news, good news, good news, good news, good news, Lord, I heard from heaven today. And right in the midst of that, the door opened and a man with a solemn face said, "The Japanese have just attacked Pearl Harbor. We're in the war."
The war in the Pacific required rapid construction of ships and airplanes. The shipyards were hastily built on both coasts, and the call went out for everyone who was not already in the military to join the war effort by building the thousands of ships that were needed to win the war. This led to massive migration of Dust Bowl farmers and Blacks from the Deep South, just like Tami's father and mother, who were seeking work at the shipyards. In March 1942, the US government enlisted the Bechtel Corporation to build a new shipyard in Sausalito under emergency wartime measures. Sausalito's Pine Point neighborhood was condemned in order to build the new shipyard, and you can see it being blown up in this picture here. The 40 families who owned homes on Pine Point received only a 2-week eviction notice. And as soon as they were gone, the hillside was dynamited to fill the bay, and that land was dubbed Marinship. Just 3 months later, construction started on the first ship. The Marinship workers ramped up to build an astonishing ship each week. Within 3.5 years, Marinship workers built 93 well-made vessels that helped to win the war in the Pacific. The Marinship workforce grew to 22,000 in order to keep the yard operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Recruiting workers was difficult in the midst of a war with 10 million people enlisted in the armed forces. In addition to a few experienced shipbuilders, the company recruited women, teenagers, retired people, rural Californians, and recent immigrants from the South and the Dust Bowl states. Now, you may recognize this building here as a present-day Driver's Market, but it used to be the Marinship Hiring Hall. The massive influx of workers created a real housing crisis in the Bay Area. Public projects were hastily erected on the former 200-acre dairy immediately north of the Marinship yard. This project, named Marin City, was built by Bechtel with Maritime Commission funds and approved by the Marin County Housing Authority. By the end of 1943, Marin City had a population of 5,500 Marinship workers and their families.
So anyway, you heard about the war, but you were singing in Los Angeles. How did it come a year or two later that you actually decide, instead of singing for your supper, to weld for your supper?
Well, the decision was basically taken out of my hands. I had to continue living. And all of my plans for concerts and lecture recitals and things of that sort suddenly went down the tube because everything was canceled. And I came back to San Francisco, and I was casting about for something to do. So at that time, I was always interested in some mechanical skills with engines and things like that. And I enlisted in the Samuel Gompers Trade School and learned welding. And subsequently, and very easily, got a job at Marinship as a welder.
Marinship management soon assigned me to the select flying squadron of expert stinger welders who were sent wherever they were most needed in the shipyard. I didn't have to give up my singing career entirely, as I was often asked to sing at yard programs for my fellow workers and at ship launchings.
The Shipyards Monthly magazine noted that no one was better known or better liked than Joe James, and he was a popular favorite with his shipyard performances. It was also noted that he was a leader of progressive thought among Bay Area Negroes. The respect that Joe James had earned from his shipyard co-workers and Bechtel management ultimately thrust him into direct conflict with the whites-only Boilermakers Union.
When you started at Marinship, did you have any idea about what you were going to get into, or was that a surprise when you ran into the union problem?
No,
Had anyone told you that you were going to have to join a
I
segregated local?
I went to the shipyard and I got a job. And I don't know how long I was at work, a month or less, when somebody asked me, were I a union member? And I said, no. I said, well, you have to join the union. I said, well, that's fine. Where do I go? Where's the headquarters of the union? He said, you don't go to union headquarters. I said, why not? I'm going to join the union, am I not? No, but there's a special union for you, us, he said, because he is also a Negro. And I said, I don't understand. He said, look, we are not allowed to join the main union, but the main union has for us a separate organization to which we have to belong. I said, let me think about this. And so finally I asked some questions, and I found out that this was an auxiliary. I found out that to the initiation fee to join was the same. The due structure was the same. But the benefits were 50% of what a white person would get belonging to the union. And I said, I'm not going to put up with this. And that's the beginning of the struggle.
In August of 1943, a week after the establishment of the Jim Crow Auxiliary, I persuaded Bechtel management to let the Negro workers write the lead article, Marinship Negroes Speak to Their Fellow Workers, in the Marinship's monthly magazine, calling on all workers to turn our hatred instead against each other, against the forces of fascism. I wrote an editorial that condemned the discrimination and proclaimed that the war was being fought to prove for all times the dignity and the rights of individual man, regardless of race, creed, or color. I truly believe that Marinship itself was proof that interracial harmony was the rule, not the exception. We wanted the workers to boycott the auxiliary, not the union, and without stopping work. Our battle was against discrimination, not against the union. It was a very complicated situation.
Tami, I think this is you.
Okay. The Boilermakers Union ultimately demanded that Bechtel fire all of the workers who had failed to join the auxiliary, and pink slips were issued the day after Thanksgiving, 1943. The next day, the fired workers staged one of the largest labor protests ever in the Bay Area. 2 days later, the lawyers hired by the workers were able to get a federal judge to issue a restraining order and reinstate all of the fired workers. In addition to hiring a San Francisco law firm to represent the workers who got pink slips, we also had the assistance of Thurgood Marshall, who at the time was the lead NAACP staff attorney. President Roosevelt had issued Executive Order 8802 in June the 25th, 1941, that ordered that all defense industries would outlaw discrimination based upon race, creed, color, or national origin. And simultaneously, the Federal Employment Practices Commission was established to oversee that order. However, the order gave FEPC little authority or funding to carry out that mission. In 1943, Roosevelt moved the FEPC to the Office of Emergency Management and empowered it also to review discrimination complaints against federal departments and agencies, as well as unions and defense contractors. Ultimately, Roosevelt pressured the Boilermakers to end racial discrimination, and the FEPC ordered desegregation of local union shops. Marin County Superior Court Judge Edward Butler ruled that the Boilermakers' policy of discriminating and segregating Negroes into auxiliary was contrary to public policy, and he prohibited the union from requiring Blacks to join auxiliaries as a condition of employment, and barred Marinship from laying off workers who refused to pay auxiliary dues. If the Boilermakers wanted to retain a closed shop, they must admit Negroes as members on the same terms and condition as white workers. Marinship appealed the case to the California Supreme Court on July 14, 1944. The court ruled in the workers' favor on December the 20th, 1944, about 5 months later, holding that the Boilermakers Union and Marinship could not enforce the closed shop provisions against Black workers who refused to join a racially segregated auxiliary.
The San Francisco Chronicle hailed the decision as confirmation of the principle of no representation, no dues. The Marin Citizen said the ruling should be welcomed by every believer in genuine trade unionism, while the Communist People's World newspaper emphasized that the court had outlawed discrimination, not the closed shop.
By the time the court decision came down, I'd been elected president of the San Francisco NAACP branch, and our organization was in the forefront of every fight against open shop proposals. We thanked the white workers who had supported our cause. Both the NAACP and the Committee Against Segregation were interracial groups, and that many whites had signed petitions, donated money, and discussed the issue with their fellow workers. There might have been muttering of discontent, but the decision was respected, and the conviction grew that the law at least was on the side of the Black man. As I got more involved in the NAACP and the Committee to End Segregation and Discrimination, I came to realize that the very people who had tried to ban Blacks from full membership in labor unions were the same ones who tried to maintain segregation and discrimination against all non-white people. Americans of Japanese descent were our neighbors in the Fillmore district in San Francisco. And the government just rounded them up beginning in 1942 and sent them off to what was fancifully called relocation centers. Let's tell the truth about it. They were concentration camps. My next door neighbors and friends were a Japanese family, the Takamotos. When we would go out of town for any reason, we would give them our keys. They would water our garden, take care of our plants, take in the mail, and do all sorts of neighborly things for us. They were our friends. And when this order came down, it was devastating to both of us, my wife and me, and the Takamotos. When they finally were forced to leave, they left some of their prized household possessions in our safekeeping. We kept them for that family until they were finally received permission to relocate to Cleveland, Ohio. We were able to ship their belongings to them. The Marinship yards had already closed by the time that James versus Marinship court ruling was issued. In 1946, I joined Noah Griffin Jr. in forming the first National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's chapter in Marin County at a celebration held in Marin City.
Joseph James performed in 15 more Broadway shows before touring internationally with Leontine Price, William Warfield, Cab Calloway, and Maya Angelou in Porgy and Bess. Later in life, he became a union organizer for the SEIU in the Bronx. Joseph James died in 2002 at the age of 91.
Joseph James wrote in 1992 the following: "One thing the Depression taught the American people is that when they come together around a common problems, they could accomplish something. Now it seems that working people have forgotten that." That's our presentation on Joseph James. Thanks in large part to a writing of Dana. It's been great to do this.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you, Tami.
Thank you both, Dana and Tami. It's so obvious that hours of preparation went into this, and it's an inspiring story and one that that needs to be told widely. And as Dana said, is particularly apt for our times. I want to also shout out a big thanks to the Sausalito Historical Society. We have done so many fabulous programs together over the years, always the most popular programs inside the library. When we're able to return to this space that you can see behind me, unfortunately virtually at this moment, but that time is going to return to us, and we'll all be back together again before we know it. We received lots of questions from people, and Tami and Dana have gone through them and picked a list that we're going to run through, and we may tack on some at the end. And if you want to ask a question, I can't guarantee that we'll get to it, but you can use the chat feature of Zoom to type in a question. So let's start out with the question that Tami is going to tackle. Did Joseph James get community support during his efforts?
That's a very interesting question. Some of our most active and important people are sort of ahead of their times. I'm sure Joseph James got some pushback from fellow Black workers who thought, listen, we're getting equal pay. Let's just go along with the auxiliary. It's okay that we sit at the back of the bus. But Joseph James insisted that, we're going to be equal. We can sit anywhere else, anywhere on the bus, to use that analogy. I would think also that much like Martin Luther King, even in Black churches, Martin Luther King received more support from white churches than he did from Black churches, to be quite honest. And when you look at the record, he made his most important speeches at in several venues, and they were usually prominent white churches on the East Coast. I can remember growing up in Marin City, and one of the questions I always sort of asked was, why aren't we supporting the civil rights movement in the South? The white church in Marin City, St. Andrew's, still exists. They had two ministers who alternated by going to the South. But my Baptist minister at First Missionary Baptist Church, Village Baptist Church, never brought up Martin Luther King's efforts. So I'm sure that Joseph James got some support from very different groups of folks, even among fellow workers. But I think he was a trailblazer.
Okay, I'm going to take the next one. The question is, do you know of any recordings of Joseph James performing in his later years on Broadway? So I put my librarian hat on the other day and did some searching. And as Dana and Tami said, Joseph James performed in production of Porgy and Bess that I believe started on Broadway and then traveled to Europe. And there was a recording made in 1952 in Berlin of this cast that featured William Warfield and Leontine Price, and Joseph James played a character named, and let me bring up my notes here.
Jake.
Yes, so he played a character named Jake, and Jake is a fisherman and has a song right near the beginning of the opera. So I'm going to, we're kind of getting out on the edge of my technical skills, but we're going to open up a Spotify window and I'm going to play the clip and try to get the volume right for people. But the song you'll hear, it comes right after Clara, who's Jake's wife, sings probably the most famous song from this opera, which is Summertime. Summertime and the living is easy, et cetera, et cetera. I won't torture you with my singing.
Give him to me. I'll fix him for you. Ladies, enjoy your time before you. All the start of traveling. A woman may mourn you, love you and mourn you. Is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing. Oh, a woman is a sometime thing. Your loving is the first to name you. That's right. And she'll tie you to her apron string. Oh, and she'll shame you and she'll blame you till your woman comes to blame you. A woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing. A woman is a sometime thing.
All right.
That's Joseph James. Wow.
Next question. And this one is for Dana. Does Mr. James have living descendants in the Sausalito Marin City area?
Well, Joseph James never lived in Sausalito or Marin City. He lived in San Francisco in the Fillmore. He did have a wife, but and doing the research, it was kind of hard to trace what happened to him through some of the intervening years because he was traveling a lot. I did find a passport or a visa for him in South America, and he was listed as single at that point. So, and then when he died, all I have is a death record. I don't think he had any children, but we can't verify it. And I would love if someone wants to do the research and see if they can find any descendants of Joseph James. It would be a great project for us.
I should add that there is an author by the name of Ron James Jr. who wrote 2 books. One was called Root and Branch, about the NAACP and its legal strategies challenging education and labor. Ron James also wrote a book called The Double V. The Double V was a symbol that the Black press came up with, the Pittsburgh Courier, to challenge discrimination in terms of fascism abroad, Nazism abroad, and racism here in America. So the double V was something I'm sure Joseph James was aware of. And this guy's name is Ron James, same last name, but I've actually called his law office and I got from someone saying, no, he's probably not related to that. He doesn't mention Joseph James in any of his books. I've read them both.
The problem with doing genealogy on Black families is, of course, everybody that came from slavery had their master's name, so that makes it even harder.
I've got a quick question that came in through the chat. If either of you know, how did Joseph James get from San Francisco to the Marinship every day when he was working as a welder?
They had ships that would leave San Francisco and come straight to the shipyard. So that's how they came in, and they had people waiting there on the docks, and they had 12-hour shifts that
came over by ferry.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got another question for Dana. This one, I'm looking at the Marinship today. How can we balance the value of a productive industrial Marinship that provides working class jobs with the need for affordable housing and a more racially diverse community?
Well, this is a tough question because, of course, Sausalito doesn't have a lot of land left for building housing of any sort, let alone affordable housing. But I give the City Council credit for recognizing that it is important to have affordable housing and it is important to have diversity. I personally think that one of the places where we can really start to build the diversity of the community is through our school district, because of course it serves both Sausalito and Marin City, and those ties are really important. And it brings in young families to the community. So I think that's one of the ways that we can help to encourage diversity.
Great. Question to Tami. How can we continue the work to bring about the change that Joseph James and others fought so hard for?
You know, it continues to be a challenge. When you look at Black unemployment rate nationally versus whites, it's usually 2.5 times higher. That is, if white unemployment is 6%, Black unemployment is 15%. And I think there's a massive hidden figure there. We've just got to do a better job of coordinating our high school education so that there is an emphasis on STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and math. And now I'm hearing the talk that college majors may not matter as much in this sort of evolving economy that we're in. So I think there's an effort to get back to some of the trades. San Rafael High School, Kennedy High School in Richmond, they're all bringing back their shops, but in a little different form. And that technology that you can use now with power tools and all is going to make it much better for young people to get into the trades and get that type of training. That should help.
Okay, here's one that both Dana and Tami are going to tackle. How would Sausalito be different today if African-American Marinship workers hadn't faced discrimination in purchasing housing?
Well, first of all, home ownership is the golden ticket to upward mobility. And when you have redlining and deed restrictions and lending problems, the Blacks and other minorities were really excluded from the housing market. Tami can talk from a personal standpoint on the struggle that his parents had just trying to build their own home in Marin City.
You know, I'll never forget, my father doesn't talk a lot about trials and tribulations. He really sort of kept that to himself. Late in life, after they built their house that still stands in Marin City, Jerry Taylor knows a lot about that. He told me a story that as he was building the house, one day he decided before going to work to go up. It was a vacant lot at the time. Remember, Marin City, all the way to about 1962 and 61, were all public housing. They tore down some of the housing on the north side and began to build what were called Barrett homes. They started right at right behind First Missionary Baptist Church, which is at 501 Drake Avenue, and they moved north along that. There were Barrett Homes 1, and then there were Barrett Homes 2 that went up the hill. And he told me the story that one day he's getting ready to go to work, so he drove up to this lot that he wanted to buy. And he walks out, it's bare land. And he says he's walking through, and a sheriff's car pulls up. The sheriff pulls out his gun and walks up to my father and basically says, "What are you doing?" This is about 6:30 in the morning, a spring morning. As Dana alluded to, financing of housing for Blacks has been a very haphazard experience. I used to make deposits at Bank of America in Sausalito. My parents had a substantial, well, their life savings was at Bank of America. And when they tried to get financing from Bank of America on this lot in Marin City for $27,000, they were turned down. And I can remember just off the top of my head saying to my father, "Dad, you got to take your money out of Bank of America and go someplace else." The other thing I would tell you is that you guys don't know it, Jerry does. The most famous San Francisco giant is Willie Mays. When Willie Mays tried to build a house, buy a house in St. Francis Woods, remember, Willie Mays is like number 1 or number 2 as a baseball player. And he was going to buy a house in St. Francis Woods. And when the real estate interests in San Francisco found out about it, they came to Willie Mays and said, "Willie, we love you as a player, but you can't live in St. Francis Woods. We'll buy you out and give you $60,000. Willie Mays took that money and built his house down in Hillsborough, where he lives today. I can remember driving out 19th Avenue, right at about just before it gets to Terraville. There used to be a big sign there for Sunstream Homes. Those were those tight little houses that were right next to each other. I can remember in the 50s driving out there, and my mother and father in the front seat, I'm in the back. Let's go into Sunstream Homes. My father said, "No, we're not going in there." It was clear to everyone that Sunstream's home was not going to allow any Black or any Asian, that is Chinese or Japanese, to live in the avenues. And of course, there's the book called The Color of Law by Robert Rothstein. He's a UC Berkeley, Haas public policy person. And he highlights the travails of housing finance. Daly City. Daly City was built by the federal government, and there were restrictive covenants in those deeds. So, and remember, California had a fair housing law. It was designed by and passed the state legislature by Byron Rumford. And by initiative, the real estate interests in California had it overturned. It was taken to court. They went to court, and California Supreme Court ruled that fair housing could not be overturned by initiative.
Okay, question for both of you. What got you interested in Joseph James?
Dana, you should talk to that.
Oh, okay. Well, as Abbott mentioned, I didn't realize until I moved to Sausalito that my father had spent 3 years in the Pacific Theater at most of the major campaigns on an oiler that was built in Sausalito. And so there was a real connection there. And when I was serving on the Historical Society board, I started learning about Joseph James, and it immediately piqued my interest. I've also always had a passion for racial justice. I grew up in integrated schools and in an integrated neighborhood when right after the Rumford Act was ruled as applying by the state Supreme Court. And then when I was in college, I worked with some Black women community organizers trying to deal with some real crises in their community that was struggling with white flight and racial injustice. And throughout most of my career, I had bosses that enabled me to work with underserved communities. I was in public service in Oceanside, a community with Samoans and lots of Latinos and Black populations. And I got a chance to work with the community there to get money, bring in special services and lift those communities up. So Joseph James was just a real thrill and a role model. And here he was, somebody that grew up orphaned as a kid and managed to really do a tremendous amount in his lifetime. He was really a Renaissance man. So I got doing the researching and I couldn't stop.
I got interested in Joseph James a lot to do, it occurred because the president of the Historical Society said to me one day, Tami, why don't you look into this? Look into Joseph James. I'd been to the visitor center at Marinship and there was a picture there of him. So when Jerry Taylor said, look into this, I said, okay, I knew about the court case, but I really wanted to find out, how did this man take on this challenge? He could have just said, listen, I'll earn my keep. I won't take on any of this heat, because he must have gotten some blowback on this. It would be interesting, for example, the FBI has been tracking people for years. They had a whole list of things that they tried to pin on Martin Luther King. I suspect Joseph James has an FBI file. And it probably doesn't start out with meritorious service. So especially during the war years.
Okay, here's one for Tami. The question is, can you tell us a little bit more about what you know about race relations in this area at the time outside of the workplace?
There's this perception that Marin City was sort of an integrated community. Workers lived everywhere. That's not true. Marin City was segregated. There was a Black side of Marin City and there was a white side of Marin City. I recently talked to the third Black family to live in Mill Valley, the Robinson family. Some of you may know, when Patty Hearst was captured, there was a Black U.S. Marshal standing next to her. His name was Glenn Robinson. Glenn Robinson grew up in Marin City, and his wife, his widow, I met her about 2 years ago in Marin City at the senior center. And I asked her, I said, Ms. Robinson, what was it like to live in Mill Valley? I said, I thought you guys were the second Black family there. She said, no, we were the third. And she told me about the experience of the first Black family to move to Mill Valley. When they had to use a white family to set the groundwork and get ready to sign papers to own this house in Mill Valley. And then the Black family shows up. Apparently when some of the folks, neighbors found out, they burned a cross in front of the first Black family to live in Mill Valley. And one time and later on, they went on vacation and someone burned the house down. if you remember, the second Black family to live in Mill Valley, and I have to just tell you this because these are people I know. With the Collins family, Joyce and Jerry and others. If you were at Tam High School in 1954, 55, 56, and so on, the Collins were Chip Collins, several. Well, their father was Daniel Collins. He was a dentist in San Francisco, but he was also the co-publisher, co-founder of the Sun Reporter. That was the Black newspaper, published weekly. I used to deliver the Sun Reporter in Marin City. And they had to get into Mill Valley the same way that the first Black family. They had to have a white family pose and look at the house, get ready to sign papers, and then the Collins family moved in. Ironically, one of the Collins sons is now one of the best top earning real estate brokers in the county.
Okay, we've reached our final question, which will go to both Tami and to Dana. And taking another look at the events of the past year, particularly the last month here in the United States. What have been the ramifications of this extraordinary citizen, Joseph James, in the years following the Supreme Court decision, and even today?
You want to start, Tami, or you want me?
Why don't you, Dana?
Okay.
I'll learn something too.
I've been thinking about this, and I think one of the things that was different in the era when he lived was that during World War II, we had a country that was united. Everyone had a single focus on the war, and people were working together. I also think that it probably made a difference that the people that were working in the shipyards were those that were more disenfranchised from mainstream society. You had rural people, Blacks, you had women that had never been in the workforce, teenagers, disabled and retired people. And Joseph James referred to them as family, and you listened to, those were his real words when he said that as a rule, they all got along together. And so to me, this is just a really nice lesson that even in dark times, our country has been able to unite and have some progress. And I'm a bit of an optimist, but I'd like to think that perhaps with changes that are going forth in our country, that we can achieve some more unity and certainly racial justice and social justice.
You know, I would agree with Dana's remarks. I would throw in one cautionary story that I think it's important to hear. Right toward the end of World War II, on the East Coast, Isaac Woodard he was a sergeant in the Army, he was leaving service. He gets on a bus with other white soldiers and Blacks and heads out of Florida up toward North Carolina. And at some point, Isaac Woodard decided, I'll just sit wherever I want to. And the bus driver was incensed and basically told him, listen, you need to go to the back of the bus. I don't care what uniform you're wearing. And at some point, the bus driver, and I think this was a Greyhound bus, stopped, got off the bus and called the sheriff in the next town that they were pulling into. And when they reached that town, Isaac Woodard in his sergeant uniform got pulled off the bus, and eventually he was blinded while he was in jail. The jailers, the people who took him off the bus, used their batons and basically pounded his eyes out. Woody Guthrie has a song about the ballad of Isaac Woodard. And I say that because I think all Black men are aware that that uniform could only be worn at certain times. You were not appreciated as a returning veteran. And if you remember, during Pearl Harbor, Dory Miller on one of the ships in Pearl Harbor, he was a cook. He was like the heavyweight champion of boxing on his ship and throughout the Pacific theater. He was a cook. He was not allowed to be a gunner or anything else. And of course, when the ship comes under fire, Dory Miller runs to a gun and shoots down several Japanese warplanes. And of course, his heroism was not appreciated until many years later. So, it's great to see Colin Powell. President-elect Biden has I forget the gentleman's name, who's going to be Secretary of Defense. But Black service throughout America's history has not been appreciated. If you remember Civil War, if you've seen the Lincoln movie, so I just keep that in mind. Though I think Dana is absolutely correct. There's been a lot of progress. Just recently at the Naval Academy, I've taken my kids to the Naval Academy. There is a new young lady by the name of Sydney, I think her last name is Harrison, who's going to be the leader, first Black female to lead the incoming class there. Big job. She graduated from there, grew up in Michigan, but she's the first one. She's the first one. So we still have a long ways to go. We still have a long ways to go. And quickly, let me ask her a question from Chris DeWeese. Chris asked the question, did your parents interact with Joseph James? No, I don't think so. But I do know that back in 1952 in Marin City, there was some sort of a meeting. I was only about 5 or 6 years old. And I can remember us walking in, I think it was during what we call Negro History Week. Now it's a month. And I bring that up because there was a cooperative group of Marin City quilters along with Sausalito quilters who put together a beautiful and award-winning quilt that was a tribute to Harriet Tubman, and they had a second one that was made to exhibit, and it was to Frederick Douglass. So there has been mutual cooperation between Sausalito quilters. Apparently that quilt is now at Emory University. It's somewhere in Atlanta, Georgia. So I really would love us to do a quilt on Joseph James.
Well, that wraps up our program. And Tami, Dana, thank you both again so much for a wonderful presentation, thought-provoking. A comment that came in through a chat from Diane Johnson, I think sums it up very well. So I'll read what she wrote. Thank you for a very thought-provoking session. I hope the next generation realizes how recently these rights for union representation, housing, and civil rights were legislated. We still have a long ways to go. I'm sure you would hear a rousing applause if we were all together. And I will conclude our program just by wishing everyone the best and good health during these difficult times. And we're all going to pull together through this. And I'll just look forward to seeing you all in the library and at library programs in the not too distant future. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Abbott.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Good to see you, Joyce.